Hey guys, it's Mitch. How's it going? Yep, I'm finally hitting it. We're looking today at what would have potentially been the greatest team up between creators of 1992. Unfortunately, this was put out in 2005 when we arguably got the worst versions of both of these creators. We're looking at All-Star Batman and Robin #1. So this is written by Frank Miller and drawn by Jim Lee, as everybody knows, I'm sure. And let's get it right up front. This is a total clusterfuck. I said off the hop, this is the worst version of both of these creators. I should probably just clarify that, at least on one guy's part. This isn't Jim Lee's fault. This is my least favorite version of Jim Lee, I would say. Jim Lee's kind of interesting in that he often kind of wears his influences on his sleeve. Earlier in his career, I would say those influences were just more interesting to me. So that would have been influenced largely by Michael Golden, Art Adams, Appleseed, Barry Windsor-Smith on A Weapon X, and the sum of those parts was this very aesthetically pleasing kind of style. Since then, his influences, I would say, have been a bit more problematic. One of them largely has been J. Scott Campbell. I don't like the way that Jim Lee has tried to emulate a lot of J. Scott Campbell's style. He's kind of read the room on where digital color is going, and he's dialed back on things like rendering and heavy shadow, leaving it largely up to the colorists. And I don't like when Jim Lee does that. I don't think Jim Lee kind of takes very well to a clean line kind of style. When I see a Jim Lee book, I want to see hatching and shadow all over the place. I want to see a lot of lines drawn in ink. Now, that's just me. I mean, I think there's other people who probably feel the same way, but a lot of people seem to be, they seem to enjoy Jim Lee's current style, and that's absolutely fine. And as I said before, Jim Lee isn't the problem on this comic. He's putting in a ton of work on this thing. Even in this comic, in a style that I don't enjoy nearly as much as his earlier style, there's a lot of good drawings in here. Most of them are drawings of backgrounds. But there is a lot of work put in, and I appreciate that. So that means the problem in this is largely down to Frank Miller. And I don't think anybody would argue with that. Again, if this was 1992, I think Frank Miller would be in do no wrong kind of territory. In the decade previous to that, he's knocked out Ronin, Dark Knight Returns, Daredevil Born Again, Batman Year One, and the first Sin City story. That's a crazy fucking resume. Even in the years directly after 1992, he's doing some great stuff with Dame to Kill For, Big Fat Kill. I feel like it's starting to taper off there. Yellow Bastard, same thing. 300 is great, although it is worth mentioning that a lot of that is down to Lynn Varley. You've also got stuff like Hard Boiled in the mix, Martha Washington, RoboCop versus Terminator's in there, and I do enjoy that a fair bit. The problem is in the time directly before this, when you get shit like Dark Knight 2 and Holy Terror. Those kind of put a big old question mark on Frank Miller. Not big enough to really dampen down the star status that Frank Miller had, just enough to kind of be like, ugh. But, you release a project saying that Frank Miller is going to be teaming with Jim Lee. In 2005, people are going to get excited no matter what. And I mean, this comic sold great. It sold in excess of 300,000 copies. That's like Jim Lee Fantastic Four #1 territory, which was a huge success. I think the biggest problem with Frank Miller is that if he doesn't have a project that he's passionate about, a story that he's been working on and really feels strongly about, he doesn't produce good work. I think that's just how it goes. I think the writing was on the wall for that. You look back as far as 1994 with Batman Spawn. That thing's a piece of shit. And even that was predecessed by his issue of Spawn. Spawn #9, I think. Again, just not worth reading. You look at Dark Knight 2, which he didn't want to do. It sucks, and I think it almost intentionally sucks. It feels like a big old middle finger from Frank, and I think that's how it can be summed up. Even on Sin City, the last storyline, Hell and Back, I think at that point, he's done with Sin City. He doesn't have anything new and interesting to say, but Sin City sells. And it's his thing that he's known for. He's got to have new Sin City stories. He said he has an infinite amount of Sin City stories he can tell. But that one feels like it was cranked out just because he felt he should put out another Sin City book, because he knew it would sell. So you come around to this, and this is it's going to be more of the same, I think. Frank Miller has had exactly one thing to say about Batman, and he said it in 1986, in The Dark Knight Returns. The thing is, everybody loves The Dark Knight Returns, and they want him to keep telling Dark Knight Returns type stories. Frank doesn't want to tell Dark Knight Returns type stories, I don't think. Even Batman Year One, he was kind of iffy on that. That was a contractual obligation as part of The Dark Knight Returns, was that he would have to do an origin story as well. And he wanted to do that as a standalone graphic novel. And wasn't too happy about the idea of serializing it. But, the thing got done, and he's got David Mazzucchelli providing masterful artwork on it. The story itself is good. Is it great? I don't think it is, really. Like I said, I think it's very, very good. It lines up well with the Dark Knight Returns version of Batman that he'd already set up. But everything that he's had to do since then to do with Batman has not really been worth reading, I don't think. So to elucidate, let's get into this. This is going to be that version of Batman, kind of halfway between Batman Year One and Dark Knight Returns. We can start with the cover. This thing came out in 3 covers. There's the Batman variant, there's the Robin variant, and there's the Batman and Robin variant, which is just the 2 images mashed together. And this is a good cover. On its own, pretty good, anyway. The Robin one, I suppose, it's fine. I don't know who wants the Robin cover. I think probably the best version of this is the one with the 2 of them together. But, this is a decent pose of Batman that's nicely rendered with a very nice background behind it. Like I said, the backgrounds in this are probably going to be the star of the show, which probably shouldn't be the case. Kind of an interesting choice to heavily shadow Batman's face, which I think is a little bit of foreshadowing in that this is going to be a Batman that is not very relatable, and you're not going to like him too much. He's a little bit of a villain. Anyway, so let's get started here. All right, Batman and Robin, The Boy Wonder, Episode 1, by Frank Miller, Jim Lee, and Scott Williams on inks. All right, so this is essentially the origin of Robin. That's kind of the point of this series. Batman's been established in Gotham for a while at this point, and this is going to be the beginning of the dynamic duo. Except, of course, that in this version, Frank Miller doesn't think of them that way. This isn't Biff, Bam, Pow, whatever the fuck. Frank Miller sees this version of Batman as being more of a drill sergeant. Like he said it in Dark Knight Returns, where Jason was a good soldier for me. That's how he views his Robins, as troops in a war. So he's got to be a hard-nosed kind of leader. And I mean, this is an okay splash to start things off with, I suppose. It doesn't look like anything that should be in a Frank Miller book ever. You think about the successful things that Frank Miller has done. You think about the artwork that was in those. They were either by Frank himself or by David Mazzucchelli. That's kind of it, really. Like stuff like Hard Boiled and Martha Washington, they're kind of in their own territory, where it's not, I would say, his greatest hits. Like Hard Boiled is amazing, but that's more Jeff Darrow's greatest hits. But either Frank drawing in his, regular comic book type style, or Frank drawing in his high contrast, no holding lines type style, or David Mazzucchelli doing Daredevil or Batman. You get that grim and gritty feeling. It's very grounded. It could be any crime story. And that's what you need. And that's not what we're getting here. We're getting Heroes Reborn Fantastic Four. That's the look here. I don't mind the drawing too much. I like the amount of black that he's getting in Robin's leotard here. This is, of course, when Robin is part of the Flying Graysons. We'll note, next to no shadow on anything that's not leotard, partially because I guess he's very young, so you just don't do that so much with people who are younger, but also because that's the style he's going for, where he's leaving it up to the colorist. And a lot of work in the background here, a lot of scaffolding, all this, these are all, there's some work put in on these people in the background. They're not just amorphous shapes. Of course, a lot of it gets blotted out by stuff like this by the colorist. But this is absolutely fine. If, you're excited about reading about Batman and Robin's early adventures, this is kind of what you would expect by any other writer anyway. All right, more of Robin flipping around. Okay, a fair bit less drawing on this page. And I don't like the drawings very much here, I gotta say. Particularly not this goofy-ass drawing of Robin. But, we're just showing that, he's having the time of his life. And, he's doing death-defying shit with his parents. Everything's great. Life is fantastic. And Frank is going through the motions. He's doing his Frank Miller thing. He knows the Frank Miller tropes. One of the Frank Miller tropes is that you repeat yourself 3 or 4 times when you're trying to illustrate character elements. So here we get, but I know for sure I'll get through this. They're always there for me. They always catch me. Mom and Dad, they always catch me. They're always there for me. They're always there for me. I fly. This is the problem with Frank. This is why I don't like latter-day Sin City stuff, too. Not just for the writing, although the writing, it does kind of, it goes kind of downhill. Frank had a tendency in terms of his art to find kind of a formula that worked and then, optimize that formula, and then that was the thing he was going to do. Really, it's kind of a similar approach to what Jim Lee does with his art, where he just kind of finds the optimal images and memorizes them and perfects them and reproduces them faithfully over the course of the rest of his career. Frank Miller does that with drawing techniques. You look at Dame to Kill for the early issues, and he's finding interesting ways to set up pretty much every shot in like the first 3 issues of that series. And you can almost see his brain working, trying to find interesting ways to light things so that it'll work in a high contrast, no holding line style. The problem at the end of that series is that he's figured out most of the things he needs to know in order to do that. So he's not trying anymore to come up with interesting ways to light a scene. He knows the things that will work. He did a similar thing with his writing, although I do feel like it's just, okay, what's the Frank Miller voice? What have I done before? I repeat myself a lot. I talk a lot in first person. I use short sentences. And by this point, Frank has written in that voice so often that he doesn't have to come up with interesting ways to craft a line of narration or dialogue. He just knows what a Frank Miller line sounds like. All right, we've been staring at Vicky Vale here for a little while. We might as well get to Vicky Vale. So, Gotham City, Vicky Vale, columnist, gadfly, dictating. She's trouble, the kind of trouble you want. So, okay, we're definitely going for a noir kind of feel in every way except how the comic looks and how it's presented. That's another problem. We're doing a very clean line style. We're going super light on shadows, except for the one hand, which doesn't make any kind of sense. That's, okay, whatever. I feel like maybe Jim Lee felt like he should have something on the back of her hand here, because just like a flat surface, like he did on pretty much the rest of her, felt a little bit empty, but it's like, you don't want to give her like crone hands. It should probably be shadowed. You know what? With the way it's angled, it could theoretically be like completely silhouetted and didn't take into account the way the rest of her is lit up like she's in a fucking daytime soap opera. And then the colorist saw this and didn't even notice the black hand and gave her an edge light like she's just lit up from the window here. So just people not really paying too much attention. It's a fine drawing of a woman. It doesn't make any kind of sense. She's just kind of parading around her apartment in her underwear. Women do that, and her high heels, sipping a martini, dictating her next column, I suppose. That's her deal, right? She's a columnist, I think. The only thing I know about Vicky Vale is from the 1989 Batman movie. From everything I've heard, like that's all anybody knows about her. But Frank wants to look at this in a noir kind of context, even though, again, it doesn't look like a noir book, even though Dark Knight Returns wasn't a noir book. But that's kind of the vein he's been in for the last 10 years or so. Batman should kind of work with noir, theoretically, right? It's like, yeah, if you're not thinking at all about how this project is actually going to turn out. And she's going to keep doing it. She's going to keep walking around her apartment, doing sexy things, like dipping her finger in her martini and sucking on it, like just zooming in on her ass while she does her dictating. I assume what this is Jim Lee trying to approximate Frank Miller pages. At first I wondered if maybe Frank Miller provided Jim Lee with a few select breakdowns, because there's elements in this that look a little bit like stuff you might see in Sin City, like the ass zoom in. I can totally see this being in A Dame to Kill For. It might be. Same with this, where she's sucking on her finger to a degree. I can kind of imagine that, and Jim Lee's going a little bit heavy on the shadows in this particular panel, although, he's not thinking too much about contrast. He's just like, there's a lot of shadow in a Sin City book. There's just not a lot of thought in any of these pages. And she's just kind of wandering around her column, apparently, or maybe it's just notes on a column. She's just kind of bitching about how Metropolis gets Superman, who seems cool. Gotham gets stuck with Batman, who seems like creepy. And it's not like Batman's Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne's so hot and sexy and rich. And then there's a buzz, and we do a quick zoom out to show her enormous fucking apartment. I assume that's what this is. Turns out that she's getting buzzed by Alfred, who is letting her know that Bruce Wayne is inviting her out for a date. And she gasps and says, "I'll be right down." Of course, this woman prancing around in her fancy underwear, drinking her martini, in a gigantic apartment in what one can assume is an expensive part of Gotham, which is probably an expensive city in areas. So not only is she a columnist, I think one can assume probably socialite as well. I don't think she's going to get butterflies over somebody like Bruce Wayne. You know, that's, I suppose, conjecture. But again, it just kind of, we're going to get like different sides of Vicky Vale here that don't really match up. Here she's kind of catty and very like above it all, judgy, that kind of thing. And then she immediately goes into fluttering schoolgirl. And then we're going to get a gratuitous ass shot as she goes rummaging through her closet, tossing out things. And she's going to go trying on every outfit in her wardrobe, I assume. That seems to be the point here. Meanwhile, Jim Lee is going to approximate a thing Frank Miller might do in something like Dark Knight Returns or Ronin, maybe. I don't know that he would do this in Sin City, where we're just piling on all of the tiny little panels here to show, you know, Alfred waiting over and over and over again. There's at least 6 photocopies of the one drawing of Alfred checking his watch. We get Vicky putting on makeup, Vicky putting on heels, Vicky putting on underwear. We get like this procession here as we get like a quarter of a drawing of Vicky, I don't know, trying on a skirt, taking that off or putting on something else, trying on a different dress, checking out another one, checking out a completely different outfit. This stuff almost strikes me as like Silvestri-esque. Like these shots here look like the kind of thing Silvestri would do, and much more fluidly, I would say. Like, it doesn't seem awkward when Silvestri does it. It just seems like he really wants to draw women in fashionable outfits, in fashion poses. This feels like Jim trying to do way too much on a 2-page spread and not really accomplishing much of any of it. It doesn't work. And again, Frank is going to damp everything down with his repetition. I'm having a date with Bruce Wayne. I'm having a date with Bruce Wayne. I'm having a date with Bruce Wayne. Oh, did you hear? I'm having a date with Bruce Wayne. You know, you can do that in a way where she's single-mindedly focused on the one thing and then have it as sort of an inner monologue narration kind of thing and hover around the same theme. Or you can just reiterate the same thing 4 times in a row, and that has exactly the same effect. Like I said, I don't think Frank gives a shit about this project. I think this is a paycheck, and that's about it. I don't think he's having fun with it. I don't think this is anything he wants to do at all. I don't think he has anything particularly interesting to say about Batman in his prime. I think Jim Lee is excited about this. I think Jim Lee was definitely influenced by Frank early on in his career. You look at his run on X-Men, where you got the Elektra Psylocke, you got the Carrie Kelly Jubilee. We're calling back to the Chris Claremont, Frank Miller Wolverine miniseries with the ninjas. Later on, Jim Lee, runs his own company. He can make his own comics. And what does he do? He goes and produces a comic in a high contrast, no holding lines kind of style, sort of. Why? Because he's a big Frank Miller fan, and that style looks like fun. He wants to try it out for a whole 2 issues. Yeah, I think Jim would have been really stoked to work on a Batman project, particularly with Frank Miller, who's, at least for 2 storylines, an iconic Batman writer. And I mean, Jim Lee, let's face it, isn't the best judge of good writing. You look at pretty much everything he put together after they started up Image. So Frank's sending him scripts, and I think Jim Lee isn't even thinking like, wait, what's going on in the script? He's just like, oh boy, I'm going to draw this page and this page and this page. And it's got to be cool because Frank Miller's writing it. So anyway, this is, oh man, we're like 6 pages into this thing, I think, and it's already a video full of tangents and rabbit holes. So I can only imagine what the eventual running time on this thing is. So, anybody who's still sticking around, I appreciate your patience. I think I've gotten most of the A-sides out of my system now. So we're going downstairs, one can assume hours later, because women take a long time to get ready for a date, you see. And it's a pretty great shot of, I assume, downtown Gotham, with some nicely drawn buildings in the back here, nicely lit. This is the kind of thing I've seen Jim Lee do on live streams. He can do it fairly easily. He's got a formula down now. Alfred meets her at the car, tells her that Bruce is going to be taking her to the circus. She's like, oh, sure, yeah, whatever. I don't give a fuck. I'm going on a date with Bruce Wayne. I don't know if you heard my inner monologue before. And oh, look, it's Batman with a milk mustache. Nobody ever needed to see that. Back to Robin, because this story is all about Robin. Back on the trapeze. Back to repeating stuff that Frank Miller has said earlier, such as, they're always there for me, they always catch me, I fly. Pretty easy page for Jim Lee to draw here. You know, nothing out of the ordinary. Nice movement on the character here. Decent figure work. Only, wait. Oh, okay, yeah, he falls off the trapeze. He seemed like he did okay there. He hooked it pretty well with his knees. But no, he falls off the trapeze. And he's falling. We got to look right up his gooch to know for sure. In the crowd, Bruce Wayne is there with his date, Vicky Vale. Vicky is horrified. She goes, oh my God. And Bruce says, don't worry, darling. This kid knows what he's doing. So he's calling her darling on the first day. So I imagine he assumes that the date is going to go well, even though he took a very fancily dressed woman to the circus. And Dick Grayson pulls a full-on batarang out of his jockstrap. And this is the moment that Bruce Wayne knew that this was the kid destined to be the next Robin. He's already got the gear. Again, these panels are absolutely fine. You know, they're pretty fun. There's some good energy going on and stuff like this with all the kind of scribble in the background here for the background zooming past. A little bit stodgy on the actual page design, but then that's Jim Lee for you. And yeah, he kind of Spider-Man snags the wire and saves himself. Again, we got to look right up his gooch. That's the confirmation sign. It's a fine pose. I've got nothing wrong with this pose. It's got the classic kind of Jim Lee thing where he twists it up. You know, twist the shoulders one way, twist the hips the other way, and that's how you provide dynamicism. Everything looks pretty good and in proper proportion. A lot of drawing in the background here. A lot of drawing getting washed out by computer color. But hey, whatever. It all looks very well done. And in the crowd, Vicky says, this kid's amazing. And Bruce says, yeah, I've had my eye on him for a while. He's something all right. Which is creepy. And Vicky notices the creepy. She says, why have you had your eye on him? And Bruce turns to her at suggestively and says, I've got an eye for talent. And he's like, what? And Vicky considers the fact that she's sitting there with a predator, but it's a very good-looking rich predator, so she thinks, the more this guy tells me, the less I know. What doesn't help me at all is that I'm totally gone on him. I'm having a date with Bruce Wayne. So the lesson there is, if you're attractive and have a shit ton of money, you can get away with saying fucking anything. So the Flying Graysons, they completed their act successfully, and they all pose very stiffly, and then immediately Ma and Pa Grayson get assassinated. They get shot in the head before they've ever had a line of dialogue. So these are not people. These are not characters. These are props. Again, Frank, I feel like working in a 22-page limit, he just finds it confining. He has a few things he wants to accomplish in this issue, most of which is, setting up the Grayson family, the Grayson parents getting assassinated, and Dick Grayson meeting Batman. Using a lot of splash pages, using some double page spreads. I don't know if this is done Marvel method. It might be. I mean, Jim Lee's kind of used to that. He's used to kind of running the show when it comes to the art on a book. So I imagine that's how that went down. And of course, Jim Lee isn't a very good storyteller, is a pretty bad writer, judging by Divine Right. He just didn't think of the stuff with the Grayson parents about actually establishing things. So, really, in order for this to actually have worked, Frank would have had to have put together a complete script, which I don't think he really wanted to do. Jim was like, I'm used to just kind of doing the pages on my own and handing them off to the scripter. And Frank was just like, shit, yeah, I get paid either way. When it's always kind of been clear that in order to get the best out of Jim Lee, you need somebody with a firm hand on the tiller, somebody who gives him very distinct instructions on how to construct a page. Anyway, the point is, we got to the cover of Batman number 404, the beginning of Batman Year One. That's essentially the point of this issue. Of course, in that, it looked very grim and gritty. It was kind of tragic. Here, it's done in this flashy style, and the poses are all stiff because just Jim wasn't thinking too much. He's just kind of trying to put down what he remembers of that cover. And maybe the Robin stuff was getting close to the end of his drawing schedule, and he's kind of approaching the due date for these pages. And, Jim Lee's never been that great with keeping to a schedule for that kind of thing. So these look a little bit dashed off. Again, I'm not blaming Jim Lee on this. You know, if he'd had a bit more instruction and maybe had a bit more time, he could have made this look better, I think. All right, so in the crowd, Bruce Wayne still sits with Vicky Vale. Vicky Vale looks shocked. And then Vicky Vale looks shocked alone as Bruce Wayne disintegrates, as Batman is wont to do. And then the dude who I assume did the assassinating, you know, we didn't see him setting up or anything, starts running away, putting a pistol away. So he like dead-eyed these two in the head, like center of the forehead, while they were, I assume, on a trapeze with a pistol. And Frank gets back to repetition because drama comes in threes. Oh, wait, no, I think that's comedy. That's why this is so funny. Well, Batman thinks to himself, the boy has entered my world, and he'll never leave it. There's no way out of it. There's no way out. There's no way out. No way out. And then we got our Batman. He's just kind of the shape of his cape off in the distance here. You know, snake poison. Turns out the stuff works. I hope it's got some nasty side effects. As a matter of fact, I checked. Oh, so you knew it had some nasty side effects. Okay. It does. Oh, good. This killer will be pulling bugs that aren't there out of his ears for a month. Snake venom does that to you. Cool. So this is Jocko Boy Vanzetti. Not the best name I've heard Frank come up with. Any dirty job there is for anybody who wants it. Caught myself a 6.5 foot long minnow. There's a lot of food chain to work my way up. But first, the kid. Dick Grayson, age 12. And there we're playing the hits. We're getting back to that yellow bastard with Nancy, what's her name, age, whatever it was. You know, I don't like Jim Lee's style, but at least Jim Lee's not being lazy on this. I don't know that I've seen anything really that Jim Lee's ever been particularly lazy on when it comes to drawing. But the writing, yeah, this is some lazy fucking writing. And of course, it just doesn't work. You know, he keeps trying to be grim and gritty because that's what everybody expects from Frank Miller. And Jim Lee keeps turning in like Wildcats pages because that's what Jim Lee draws. You know, I mean, would this have looked any better in the style he did on Deathblow? Maybe, but even then, like Jim Lee just isn't the guy you get for a Frank Miller story, as much as he, I'm sure, would like to do a Frank Miller story. Not everybody's style works with everybody, and that's okay. You know, plenty of artists I don't think would work with Frank Miller. Just about anybody who ever worked at Image, I would slot in there. Maybe Mike Grell. But we've seen the guys who work well with Frank Miller. It's guys like David Mazzucchelli. I think Mike Mignola would work very well with Frank Miller. Walt Simonson, it was weird, but honestly, it was the kind of thing where you just kind of got swept along and you didn't really notice if there was any kind of dissonance between the writing and the art, because like everything was just happening so fast and there's so many explosions going on. This is slow build stuff with Frank trying half-heartedly to build mood. With a guy who does his best work doing flashy splash pages of superheroes. It was never going to work. All right, so down in the crowd, Vicky Vale is getting apprehended by a police officer. And in this, there's something rotten in Gotham City. It wears a badge. So we're getting down to Dirty Cops, which works in the universe, well, the Batman type of universe that Frank Miller has set up in Dark Knight Returns and Batman Year One. Cops are taking Dick Grayson away. Vicky's trying to advocate for him, saying he's been through hell, for God's sake. Just look at him. He's got to go to the hospital. Cop says he's in good enough hands. She says, yeah, I've seen what you cops do with your hands. What girl in Gotham has it? And who knows what you do to little boys. So we're getting kind of creepy and nasty. In a way that would work in Sin City. Probably not Dark Knight Returns or Year One. Well, maybe like the Year One Selena Kyle stuff, that would fit in okay. But naturally, he takes offense and swats her in the mouth. Says, got a mouth on you, don't you, babe? Only now it ain't so damn pretty. And, you know, like this would work in a Sin City book, in a high contrast black and white, no holding line kind of style. Doesn't work with this glammed up Jim Lee stuff. Pretty odd choice of angle here. For the extreme low angle, like Dutch angle shot, works. And it ends up just kind of being a shot of Vicky's boobs, so I guess that was kind of the point there. So the cops take off with Dick Grayson in the back seat. Vicky finds Alfred, and you get the impression he was just going to take her home. She just kind of shoves him aside, says, I'm taking the wheel. And they take off after the cops. We get the low angle with the car zooming over the horizon here in a way that would have been done in A Dame to Kill For. Looks a little weird in this thing here, like it's kind of a cartoony action with a not cartoony style. In the back of the cop car, Dick Grayson is in the hands of the cops, literally here. They're trying to tell him how what happened to his parents was a terrible accident. He's like, nope, my parents were murdered. I remember what the guy looked like, and I can identify him. Which is the wrong thing to say because the cops are in on the assassination of a flying trapeze troop. Why was a flying trapeze troop assassinated anyway? Like, shouldn't that have maybe been established just a little bit in this comic? Like, I'm sure we'll get a reason eventually where it turns out they're mixed up in something. But like, again, we're not really treating the dead parents as anybody before this. They're just dead bodies that need to be archaeologized. And Vicky and Alfred have caught up so that Vicky can take photos of the cops brutalizing a kid. And for some reason, my copy, there's a big old ink smudge over some of the narration here. I don't mind with this comic because the narration just kind of sucks. Again, more repetition. Something. I don't get it. Why kill the aerialists, then use the cops to do Lord knows what to their boy? It doesn't make any sense. And then, all the bats in the world kind of zoom down on their location. And we're going to get the Batman inner monologue, which we've been getting intermittently throughout the second half of this comic, saying, I knew these cops would take the boy to the gulch, so I set up my sonics. Bats like my sonics. They like them a lot. Which is a really dumb fucking line. I get that he's trying to keep it kind of short and punchy, like this is Mickey Spillane. But there's a point where simplistic just kind of floats over into stupid, and we've passed that point. So the cops decide to leave the kid here. They're like, screw the damn brat, let the bats eat him. And that's when the Batmobile comes zooming in and like splits the car in two. I think that's what it does. We got the front half here with the tire flying that way, and so he just killed all the cops in there. So I guess the whole point of the Sonics was just to get the cops into the car so that he could murder them all. Like, that's kind of the point of this Batman, is that he's so dark and gritty that he doesn't mind killing, like, fucking anybody. The problem is, of course, that people like that about Batman, that he's got that rule. Like every once in a while you want to see an Elseworlds kind of thing, or you want to see a villain so evil that it pushes Batman, like, right up to that line, or maybe with somebody evil enough, like, pushes him over. But I don't think too many people want a Batman for an extended period who just murders anybody he perceives as being against his mission. So we end things pretty quickly here. Like, there probably should have been a moment of, like, quiet after this. But, Dick Grayson gets grabbed by the front of his leotard and hoisted up by Batman, saying, you've just been drafted into a war. So this is right after being, like, pretty heavily traumatized. Batman's going to go and traumatize him some more, which is, I think, Frank's intention, is that he wants Batman to brainwash Robin into being a vigilante. This version of Batman is kind of twisted. Like, he had a tragic past with his parents getting killed, and he got pretty dark about it, and he had too much money, and he turned himself into a weapon, and now he's trying to turn somebody who had similar circumstances into a similar kind of weapon. Last shot here. It's okay. I don't think it's a particularly cool shot. He didn't pick a particularly dramatic angle, really. He put some shadow on him at least. Didn't go super heavy on the rendering, but, there's a fair amount of black here. That's all right. Again, there's no lack of effort in the Jim Lee pages. It just feels like Jim Lee doesn't know how to draw cool anymore at this point. So that's Batman and Robin All-Star, whatever the fuck, #1. So I think from here, a lot of you are going to know where this goes, where Batman keeps terrorizing Robin, trying to turn him into a sociopath, essentially. Shoves him in a corner in a cave, makes him eat rats, turns him into, like a survivalist. Like, I can see this making sense theoretically in Frank Miller's head. The problem is actually executing it. Again, nobody wants to read about this Batman. And, like, none of it fucking works. Like, I don't know who could have drawn this so that it would have worked better. It might have at least been a bit more fitting if someone like David Mazzucchelli drew it. It still would have been a really dumb story with really dumb narration and dialogue. But again, with this kind of glitzy, like primed for digital color Jim Lee, there's just like no synergy whatsoever. And Frank's just going to try and keep playing the hits throughout this series. We're going to get, like Dark Knight Returns versions of a bunch of characters that nobody needed to see in a Dark Knight Returns kind of setting. So we're going to see Black Canary. I don't know how you make that work in the Dark Knight Returns universe. Apparently Frank didn't either. We're going to get Green Lantern in one of the most ridiculous issues I think anybody has ever seen, where Batman and Robin treat him like elementary school bullies. And again, I can see the logic in the train of thought in that Batman and Robin, who think they're fighting in a holy war, look at Green Lantern and see a clown. So they got to tease him and like beat up on him and shit. Like bullies. I can understand the logic, but there's no way to execute that in a way that isn't stupid, I don't think. And again, if there is, Frank didn't find it. So this whole series is just wrong-headed. It speaks of cashing in a paycheck from Frank's perspective. I do think Jim Lee is excited to work on this, although, the book would come out later and later as it progressed, to the point where like a 10-issue run took 3 years to complete. Like, that must have been kind of tough from Jim's perspective, Like, he's super stoked to be finally working with Frank Miller, who's a guy he's probably wanted to work with for fucking ever. I don't think Frank ever thought twice about working with Jim Lee. The one commentary I can think of in a Frank Miller comic about Jim Lee was the time when Deathblow showed up in Sin City, having just gotten his ass beat by Marv. I don't think that Frank has any ill will towards Jim Lee. I just don't think he thinks twice about the guy. But again, like from Jim's perspective, yay, I'm working with one of the greats. And, I'm putting together this book that I'm putting a lot of try into. And it goes out and it sells like hotcakes. And it's like, yay. And, like it did the things I expected it to do. And then the reviews start coming out. And it's like, people are kind of lukewarm on this. All right, well, maybe you'll like issue 2, where he starts referring to himself as the goddamn Batman. And yeah, no, they really didn't like that. And they didn't like any of the subsequent issues, I don't think. So I imagine it probably would have been a little bit difficult for Jim Lee to find the motivation to keep doing this. Jim's not doing this for the money, I don't think. He's just sold fucking Wildstorm. He can sell any piece of original art he wants for 5 figures. I don't think he really needs this job. I think he's, this is something he wanted to do for a little while. But yeah, I don't think I'll be hitting too many more of these. I just don't want to read them. This first issue's a good enough sum up. If you want to see more of this series, Rob Norton's been covering like the whole fucking thing. I check him out every once in a while because goddamn, it's kind of funny what they've been doing with Batman, or the goddamn Batman. But yeah, going over them myself, I'm good, man. Like, best of luck to Rob on that. I think he's just about done the series too. But this was one I had to check out eventually. I'm glad I've got it out of the way now so I can never open this comic again. Yay! So next week we'll look at something completely different. For this one, though, that is going to do it. Thanks very much for watching, guys. If you like this video, please hit the like button. Helps with all the algorithm stuff. If you want to see more, hit subscribe. And if you really want to help out, in the description, there's a link to my Patreon. If you subscribe there, that'll give you access to everything I do. So all sorts of videos, all sorts of Blood Force comics. You can also follow me on Instagram and DM me there for commissions. So yeah, that'll do it. Thanks again for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.